all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida. With this video, I'm announcing that I now have a Patreon account. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you know what it's all about. But for those of you who are new, I research and write about Florida's tourism history. This is a broad topic since the state's tourism has existed for more than 200 years. Each video takes a lot of time and effort to develop and create. I work hard to cover more than the basic information on each subject and share parts of the story that aren't commonly known. Making the videos doesn't cost much since I do it all myself, but I do have to work a day job to pay the bills. That's the main reason that videos come out sporadically. As much as I'd like to do weekly videos, after 4 years of doing this, it's clearly not possible. But that's how you can make a difference. While YouTube pays out a fraction of a penny per view, Patreon allows me to directly connect with viewers who value history videos sharing relevant stories that haven't been covered hundreds of times. There are 2 levels of support, each with benefits. There will be early releases of my YouTube videos and occasional videos released only for supporters. The following video is a free example of those. It'll be the start of a series of timeline videos on subjects such as when the state's earliest attractions developed, when its national parks and monuments were established, and the progression of Henry Flagler's railroad from Jacksonville to Key West. On Patreon, I'll also share project updates, photos and videos from my trips, and images of interesting items in the archive. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description. I'd appreciate it if you'd become a patron. Your support will directly help me produce the videos and get them to be seen by more and more people. Hello all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida, Patreon edition. This is the first of what will be a series of timeline videos, specifically for the channel's patrons. These videos will explore a subject as it developed over the history of Florida. This one is about the largest cities by population. It might come as a surprise, but Florida has a rather interesting history when it comes to the population centers. There have not only been different cities that held the largest population. Oddly enough, they were spread about the 4 corners of Florida, if Florida has corners. So the first thing to point out is that I'm beginning with the arrival of the Europeans in the area, though there were an estimated 100,000 indigenous people in Florida at the time of first contact, and they were there some 14,000 years in human settlement before Columbus stuck his nose into the hemisphere. I'm also going to just use the word city, regardless of the size of the municipality, to simplify things. As many of you know, St. Augustine is the longest continuously inhabited city in the continental U.S. Founded in 1565 when the expedition of Spanish admiral and conquistador Pedro Menendez landed on the Atlantic shore, it would be the primary settlement and capital of Spanish Florida for the 236 years it was controlled by the Spanish Empire. By the way, if you find that 236 years impressive, note that it won't be until the year 2057 for the U.S. possession of Florida to finally equal the Spanish time, and that's not even counting the 20 years that the territory was in British hands. Now, while St. Augustine is well known, it wasn't the first Spanish settlement in Florida. 6 years before Menendez landed on Florida's Atlantic shore, another conquistador, Tristan de Luna Arellano, sailed into what would later be named Pensacola Bay. Leading 11 ships and a force of some 1,500 soldiers and settlers, Luna founded a settlement in August 1559. Known as Santa Maria de Ochus, it was the first most populous European settlement in Florida. Unfortunately for them, it couldn't have been worse timing, since barely a month later it was decimated by a massive hurricane, possibly the first one to kill Europeans in Florida. About a third of the Spanish were killed. All but 3 ships were destroyed, and most of the provisions which had been stored on the ships were lost. The new settlement, Santa Cruz, was located over 100 miles north of the Gulf Shore, and while Santa Maria continued to be occupied, it struggled to survive. By 1560, there might have been as few as a couple hundred people. Santa Cruz would prove to be no more successful as Santa Maria. The colonists abandoned it, moving south to Mobile Bay. By mid-1561, Santa Maria was also abandoned, with what was left of the original settlers returning to either Cuba or Mexico. In all, Spain's first settlement lasted under 2 years. The location of Santa Maria was near to the Pensacola, but that city, the second oldest in Florida, wouldn't be settled for quite a few more years.
That brings us to St. Augustine, the first successful European settlement in Florida. With an initial 600 inhabitants comprised of the settlers and military which Menendez brought with him to officially lay claim to La Florida, it had few issues in its formative years. As an aside, yes, the French established Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville a year earlier, but it never had a chance to evolve into a real settlement as it was attacked and destroyed by the Spanish not long after St. Augustine was settled. While Spain explored Florida's economic potential, it soon became clear that its primary use would be that as a buffer between their more valuable Caribbean colonies and the British colonies in North America. Because of this, Spain was satisfied with St. Augustine as the only important military center and wouldn't establish other settlements until returning to the site of Santa Maria, establishing Pensacola in 1698. St. Augustine was La Florida's main military outpost, territorial capital, and the largest city. Census data was collected sporadically using different methods, so here's a number of estimates between 1600 and 1763. The population grew steadily, even though it was one of the most remote outposts in the empire. The city sustained a number of attacks, some of which resulted in it being burned, but the population was able to retreat into the fort or the later Castillo de San Marcos, and so loss of life was typically minimal. Spain never surrendered the city nor the territory during hostilities. On the other hand, in 1763, after Britain defeated both France and Spain in the French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, Spain turned Florida over to the British, giving it an unbroken line of colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America, with the exception of a pair of tiny islands off the coast of Newfoundland, St. Pierre and Miquelon. The British allowed the French to have possession of them for fishing access. St. Augustine saw a large change in population, with the majority of Spanish residents moving to Cuba and other parts of the empire, while at the same time British colonists moved into the city. The change was largely organized, with most of the property being sold to the new arrivals. Because of the proximity of British territories, for instance, Savannah, Georgia is only 150 miles or 241 kilometers away, as well as the presence of British colonies in the Caribbean, St. Augustine became a useful waypoint for ships. British colonists also looked to develop plantations in the region to grow sugarcane, tobacco, and indigo. Yet another war would dramatically affect St. Augustine in a non-military way. The British retained possession of Florida throughout the American Revolution between 1775 and 1783, even though the Continental Congress in Philadelphia requested that Florida send representatives to look at the issues that would lead to war. This was the same Continental Congress which would later declare independence on July 4, 1776. The Florida settlers were mostly loyal to the British Crown, however, and refused to send anyone. In fact, since Florida was mostly outside of the scope of the American Revolution, many loyalists from the 13 rebel colonies fled to Florida. As the war neared its end, the population of St. Augustine swelled to an estimated 17,000 to 30,000 people, a truly remarkable number that provides a fascinating glimpse as to the division of British colonists during the Revolution. Arguably called refugees, the British loyalists were housed wherever there was space, including in tents and other temporary lodgings. The city struggled at this point, since keeping the place provisioned during the war was hardly a priority. While the Loyalists were welcomed by most St. Augustinians, they wouldn't stay very long. In 1783, when the peace treaty negotiated between the involved parties, Britain on one side and the Americans, France, the Dutch Republic, and Spain on the other, was signed, Florida was no longer in British hands. Yes, not only did Britain lose the primary colonies from Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, to Georgia, they lost all of Florida. Just like in 1763, St. Augustine swapped inhabitants, this time with the British, including many of the Loyalist refugees leaving for the Caribbean or even all the way back to Britain itself. The Spanish returned to keep the city going, but while the 20-year British era was fairly short, it forever changed the face of St. Augustine. It had become a cosmopolitan city with people from Britain, the American colonies, Minorcans, and free blacks. It's thought that only about half of the St. Augustinians in the 1780s and 90s were Spanish. Spain kept possession of Florida for another 38 years, though the city and the surrounding territory were only loosely governed by the empire. This allowed Americans to cross from Georgia and Alabama into Florida. To be honest, while the 1783 Treaty of Paris gave Florida back to the Spanish, it didn't actually establish where the border was between the territory and the United States. Today, we see that the writing was on the wall when it came to Spain's possession of Florida. While they held it for 236 years, they never did much with it. Meanwhile, the U.S. was filled with a population that was itching to explore and settle in new places. History books are filled with stories of individuals and families crossing the Appalachian Mountains to settle in new territories such as Missouri, Kentucky, and Arkansas, but Florida became a popular destination as well. By 1819, another treaty would see Florida transferred to the U.S. This time it was the Adams-Onis Treaty, named for the primary negotiators, U.S. Secretary of State and future President John Quincy Adams, and the Spanish minister Luis de Onis. The treaty went into effect in 1821, and the proverbial floodgates of American settlers began. Still, St. Augustine remained the largest city of the territory, with 1830 seeing its first inclusion in the U.S. Census. While other towns were emerging, remember Pensacola was founded in 1698, they were still small. St. Augustine remained the biggest until the 1850 census. That's 285 years under Spanish, British, and American control. 1850 saw Pensacola finally eclipsing St. Augustine, partly driven by its proximity to the ports of Mobile and New Orleans. Also, the early 1800s saw St. Augustine begin to take a back seat to development, both in Pensacola and the newly established Jacksonville. Yet another thing was that it stopped being the capital. With the population of Florida largely divided between Pensacola and St. Augustine, it was obvious that a better site was needed. That's why Tallahassee was established. It's roughly halfway between Pensacola and the Atlantic coast. Pensacola would be the most populous city in Florida, which became a state in 1845, for the next two censuses. But during the Civil War, Jacksonville began to grow. Its large natural harbor at the mouth of the St. Johns River was a link between the country's Atlantic coast and the Caribbean and South America, much like St. Augustine had been 100 years before. After the war, Jacksonville would become Florida's biggest city, at least for a while. Jacksonville benefited from the invention of steamships, which began to travel along the coast, as well as the smaller steamboats that plied the St. Johns River, connecting Florida's interior with the outside world. The St. Johns was the only navigable river in the east coast of Florida and could be traveled all the way to Lake Monroe and the present city of Sanford. Still, Jacksonville would only be the biggest city in the 1870 census. It'd lose that distinction by 1880 to a rather surprising challenger. But don't worry, we'll get back to Jacksonville later on. So far, we've had 4 places with the largest population, and they bounced between northwestern and northeastern Florida. But at this point, the biggest city will be the state's southernmost place. If you guessed Miami, you've got to go a good deal further south. How about Key West? Yes, that most remote of cities, sitting on an island of only 4 square miles or 11 square kilometers, would grow faster than Jacksonville and Pensacola at the end of the 19th century. There were a number of reasons for such growth. It was the site of Fort Zachary Taylor that held a large garrison protecting the country's southern border. During the Civil War, the city was Florida's only major settlement that remained in Union hands because of the fort. However, many of the locals were pro-Confederacy. On the other hand, there was a significant population of free blacks on the island, many of which who were originally from the Bahamas. During the war, the number of blacks grew as escaped slaves moved there due to its relative safety. The city was quite affluent due to the wrecking trade, basically an early form of marine salvage, where locals salvaged the valuables off of ships that ran aground on the coral reefs. The trade was lucrative in Key West because of the large number of ships that ran afoul of the shallow water and the frequency of storms. Fishing, salt production, sponging, and hunting sea turtles were also major industries, and in the 1860s and 70s, a large number of Cubans came to the island to set up cigar factories due to the war in Cuba. They brought quite a bit of wealth as well. All of this led to the creation of the biggest city as well as the fastest growing one in the country. Key West became one of the nation's wealthiest cities, a fact that can be seen by exploring the city's large and well-appointed 19th century homes. The remarkable growth of Key West averaged 86% over 30 years, but the boom didn't last. Growth slowed down leading into the new century, partly because only so many people could fit on the island, and the cigar factories mostly left to set up production in Tampa. By the 1900 census, Jacksonville jumped ahead in population, making it the second time it was the biggest city. It would remain so for the first half of the 20th century, growing from 28,000 residents in 1900 to 173,000 just 40 years later. Many of Florida's business interests were located in Jacksonville, and it was one of the busiest ports in the entire country. Still, as remarkable as the growth of Key West had been, and Jacksonville was, they were hardly the only Florida cities experiencing phenomenal growth. Tampa was growing as well, and finally, the Southeast began to emerge out of the Everglades, so to speak. Miami was founded in 1896, making it one of the youngest cities, but its growth would set records, going from 1,600 residents in 1900 to 249,000 just 50 years later, meaning that its growth was nearly 15,000%. Miami also has an excellent port, and it benefited from the development of the airplane. The city quickly became the country's primary connection with the Caribbean and South America. Its subtropical climate and favorable business practices encouraged the growth. In fact, the entire area was growing from Dade County northward to Palm Beach County. Miami soon became Florida's most famous city and a major destination for tourists. In the 1950s and 60s, it was regularly featured on television, with episodes of the Ed Sullivan and Jackie Gleason shows filmed in Miami Beach. That would likely have been the end point of the story of Florida's most populous city, but for one unusual occurrence. In 2025, Miami could have been the biggest Florida city. However, in 1968, Jacksonville finalized a multiple-year process when the city's boundaries were expanded to incorporate about 90% of the entire county. This meant that Jacksonville's population more than doubled to the 1970s census total of 528,000 people. Miami remained the biggest city for just 2 decades until Jacksonville rose to the top for the 3rd time. Nothing else unusual, city-wise, has occurred since, so Jacksonville remains the biggest city, Miami the second. Still, that's not quite the end of the story. As you probably know, today the largest cities are thought of more as a part of a metropolitan area. Cities are limited by their boundaries, literally called the city limits. The population of Miami, Key West, or St. Augustine is only those people who live in the political fiction that is an incorporated area. Yet those limits rarely have anything to do with where people live. For example, Jacksonville covers nearly all of Duval County. 4 cities did choose not to join back in 1968, and you can learn more about that in this video. Still, Jacksonville as a population center is more than Jacksonville and even more than Duval County. The U.S. Office of Management and Budget uses the term Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, for a geographical area that surrounds and is connected with a significant population center. It's not a legal entity, but it's used for any number of statistical purposes, and it's a good way to look at the impact of cities. So while Jacksonville is the largest city, if you consider MSAs, it's only the 4th largest metro area after Miami, Tampa, and Orlando. The Miami MSA is the largest population center and encompasses the 3 most populous counties, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. While the city of Miami's population in 2020 was 442,000, the Miami MSA was 6.2 million. It's the 7th largest MSA in the country and is also the youngest metro area in the top 25. It's an unusual metropolitan area in that it's over 100 miles long and yet only averages 20 miles wide, since it's squeezed between the Atlantic coast and the Everglades.
Florida's biggest city changed 7 times. I haven't really checked, but that might be a record for a U.S. state, and as I mentioned earlier, they're spread about the 4 corners of Florida. Yet another thing unique in American history. Each of the cities were and are tourist destinations, being some of the most popular cities with visitors. Each has fine beaches, interesting cultural sites, and fascinating histories.